Nehemiah, one of the things I discovered when you read the book of Nehemiah, hopefully some of you might be familiar with it, but I have to say that in my long journey in my Christian life, the focus in the book of Nehemiah has always been on Nehemiah, because he's the central character there. But I'd like to share with you that I learned from the Lord that really wasn't the main theme of the book of Nehemiah. Now, allow me to explain what I mean by that. So Nehemiah, most pastors will preach on the fact that it's a book that's a master class on solo leadership. Okay? Who wouldn't talk about Nehemiah as the CEO or as the leader that eventually brought back the walls and the temple of Jerusalem? Okay? And we're going to talk about that setting in a little bit. But what I learned is that, and I'm going to look at this passage in chapter 3 with you, is that it's important to know that it's about Nehemiah and how he was used of the Lord. But chapter 3 is one of the most stunning passages in the book of Nehemiah. And I shared with somebody, it's like reading the book of Leviticus. You kind of gloss over it because it keeps saying somebody's name, and it says what they did, and it says how they did it. Okay? And it's like 30-some verses with the same pattern. So I want to look at that with you. And I'm not going to read all 30 verses. We don't have the time to go through the whole chapter. But I'm going to pick certain verses in there, probably the first 15. And hopefully you'll see that pattern throughout. That God used somebody. He recorded their name. He explained what they did and what their section of the wall was all about. Okay? But before I do that, it's important that I tell you a little bit about the setting for this chapter, a little bit about the real miracle, if I can, before we move on, is not just that Nehemiah was a man that God used, but the real miracle I feel in the book of Nehemiah is that he used an entire community to restore the walls of Jerusalem. That is the real message to me in the book of Nehemiah. God used the ordinary, with him being the extraordinary God that he is, in order to cause faithful stewardship to occur. That is what I want to leave with you today, okay, is that fact that God uses all of us in order to restore and build broken walls and broken gates, whether it be in our families, our communities, our neighborhoods, our workplace, whether it be in wherever it is that God has placed you, okay? So let's turn to chapter 3 and take a look at what is this pattern that God builds in front of us. So we know the tragedy of Nehemiah. The Jewish Israelites were exiled to Babylonia. That's the background. So the walls and the temple were left in ruins for many, many years. And we learn in chapter 1 of Nehemiah that Nehemiah is introduced, and we learn that he's a cupbearer. So very interestingly, right off the bat, we learn that he wasn't someone extraordinary. He wasn't a minister, if you will. He was actually an ordinary, if you will, layman that God used to put a burden on. So it says in chapter 1 that he asked his brother, well, what's going on in Jerusalem? And his brother explains to him that it's just totally devastated. And he just didn't listen to his brother's story, but then he prayed about it. So notice the sequence. He asked, he prayed, And in that moment of prayer, he just felt very grieved. God was just percolating and just starting a burden in his heart. And he says, this is not right. God's city is in ruins. And so he spent a lot of time in prayer. And it wasn't until one day in the presence of Artaxerxes, who is the king, the Persian king, he noticed his cupbearer kind of like sad. And so he says, well, what's wrong? And he explains to him that here we are, I'm living a good life here in your presence, but my country, my people, and my city are in ruins. And so God opens an opportunity because of his prayer, and he says, well, what do you want to do about that? And he comes right out, and I think God put it on his heart to look for an opportunity and to look to God to create the opportunity to step in, because he probably said, like I say often, I don't know how this is going to get fixed. I don't have the resources. I don't know who's going to help me. I mean, the situation looks impossible. And isn't that sort of how life is a lot of times for us? Life looks a little bit impossible.